So, on Descartes' view, the mind is what we've seen him call thinking substance. He says, I am distinct from my body and can exist without it. So, the mind is something that is distinct from the body and, in principle, as he says here, is separable from it. So, this is a view according to which the mind is something that can survive our biological deaths. The mind is distinct from the body and here again can exist without it. So Descartes' broad metaphysical picture is a version of dualism, Cartesian dualism. His version of dualism is one according to which there are two kinds of things. That's the literal sense of this term, dualism. That means that there are two kinds of things. This is a broad metaphysical theory. Here again, one of the basic metaphysical questions is how many kinds of things are there? We've touched on one kind of view according to which there are only material things. We saw Hume endorsing the view that all that exists are the simple physical particles of the basic physical parts of the universe. And I've touched on Berkeley's view that we'll come to a little bit later in this unit of the course, according to which everything that exists is psychological, everything that exists is mental. There are only spiritual substances and the ideas that are in, that is to say minds, and the ideas that are in minds. And that's all that exists. Bodies are not anything distinct from minds. Bodies are just collections of ideas. We'll get to Berkeley's view in more depth a little bit later, but those would be views according to which there is only one kind of thing. Descartes' view is that there are basically two kinds of things, what we've seen him call thinking substance and what we've seen him call material substance. And the two are distinct. So there are two kinds of things, and what we are essentially is something distinct from the bodily side of our existence. Obviously, it is intimately connected with the physical side of our existence, the bodily side of our existence. The two, on Descartes' view, interact. An immaterial mind somehow interacts with a material body. So this is Descartes' version of dualism. It's come to be known as Cartesian dualism, according to which bodies and minds interact. Events in the body causally affect the mind, and events in the mind causally affect our bodies. So, what would be some simple examples? In terms of going from mind to body, you're in the mental state of intention. Perhaps you have an intention to raise your arm, and then a moment later, a physical event in your body occurs. Your arm goes up in the air. So on Descartes' view, that would be an immaterial thinking substance causally affecting a material substance, a bodily substance, what we've called a corporeal substance, a body. So there are two kinds of things, thinking substance and material substance. Thinking substance he also sometimes calls spiritual substance or mental substance. And mental substance, spiritual substance, mind, causally affects body. And what happens in the bodily side of our existence causally affects our minds, our mind as well. So you stub your toe on a desk, and that's a physical event, and then a split second later you're in the mental state of pain, say for example. So the mental causally affects the physical, and the physical causally affects the mental. There are two kinds of things, and the two kinds of things interact. That's Cartesian dualism. So to come back to the external world problem, the problem of how we know that there is a world external to mind. Broadly, Descartes' answer to that question is that the nature of external reality is grasped through the intellect. the nature of the external world, the world external to mind, the world of material substances, is grasped through pure thinking. Descartes says that bodies are not, properly speaking, perceived by the senses or by the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone. They are not perceived through their being touched or seen, but only through their being understood. So Descartes' view is that we do come to have knowledge of a mind-independent world, a world external to mind, but we get at this external world only very indirectly. We don't really know on the basis of perception. We have to think very critically about the content of perception. So here again, on Descartes' view, our mental states represent the world. And we have to sort very carefully, very critically through that representation and try to figure out which figures of the representation accurately depict the way that the world is, and maybe which features of that representation are really just in us. So that's why earlier I called Descartes' view of the relation between mind and world a kind of indirect realism. A mind-independent world of material substances, a world external to mind, is something real. That's the realist side of the term. But we get at it only very indirectly. We have to think very critically here again. We kind of have to scrutinize the representation of the world that we get in perception and try to figure out which features of that representation are really just in us. And on the other hand, what features of that representation can we be confident do accurately capture some way that the world is, some of the respects in which the world really is. So again, bodies are not, properly speaking, grasped by the senses. We really grasp what is out there by the intellect, and by the intellect alone, not by the senses, not by perception, not by the faculty of imagination, as Descartes calls it, our perceptual capacity for forming images, like the visual images formed in our visual system, but by intellect, by mind. They are not perceived through their being touched or seen, but only through their being understood. So again, intellect has to think very carefully about the content of the mind's representation of the world in perception, and sort through it very carefully to figure out which features of the representation are really just in us. So he explains this with the example of the wax. He goes back to the initial setting of the dialogue, where he's talking about sitting in his comfortable chair in front of the fire. And he says, when he sat down, he had a piece of wax. And as he's been sitting there in front of the fire, the wax has undergone a change in its sensible properties, that is to say, the properties by which we perceive the physical object. In fact, it's undergone a total change of sensible properties. All of its properties have changed in the time that he's been sitting in front of the fire. This is a very important point about this particular example. All of the sensible properties change between time one, when he sits down in front of the fire, and time two, sometime later. All of the sensible properties by which he knows the thing have changed. What would be some examples? Well, he says at time one it had a certain shape and it had a certain color. So those are properties that we detect by sight. He says when he sat down it had a certain firm shape and a yellowish color. Now he says it has a molten shape, more of a puddle of liquid shape to it, and it's turned white, so the color has changed, the shape has changed. He says that at time 1, when he first sat down, it had a certain scent, namely the aroma of flowers, the flowers from which the wax was culled. He says now at time 2, the wax no longer has that scent. It's burned off. He says at time 1, the piece of wax had a certain taste. It had the taste of honey. So think of wax candy if you're familiar with that. He says at time 2, however, it no longer has that taste anymore, no longer has that flavor anymore. When he first sat down, it had certain tactile properties. It was hard and it was cold. He says now those properties have changed. It's now soft and warm. He says at time 1 it even had certain acoustic properties. I could wrap my knuckle on it and it would emit a certain distinctive sound. Now that sound is no longer a property of the piece of wax. So all the sensible properties, that is to say all the properties by which we know the thing, have changed. So all of these properties disappear when the wax melts. But the wax still exists. Now, how do we know that? I mean that question literally. Sometimes I ask, how do we know X? And students misunderstand the purpose of the question. They think I'm insinuating that we don't know X. Sometimes I mean that question literally. I know that we know X. The question is, how is it that we know X? In this case, we do know that it's the same piece of wax at the 2 different times. But it's an intriguing question. How do we know that? Because the sensible properties, the properties by which we know the material substance, have all disappeared. They've all been replaced by another set of sensible properties. The initial set of sensible properties has been replaced by a completely different set. So how do we know that there is something that persists through that change that is the same thing, namely the piece of wax? Well, Descartes says we grasp what it is essentially, here again, not with the senses, but with intellect. In virtue of intellect, we understand that what the piece of wax really is, as distinct from its sensible properties, is something extended, something flexible, and mutable. Here again, by extended, something that takes up space. By flexible, something that can change its position, change its orientation. By mutable, something that can undergo change, namely the change of properties that we've been talking about. All these are properties of material substance. But material substance is grasped by the intellect, not the senses. Here again, what is grasped by the senses is this flux of ephemeral properties, these sensible properties that underwent a total change. And yet, we know that it's the same piece of wax. How is it that we know that? Not on the basis of our senses, because if we were just going off of perception, if we were just going off of our senses, then when there's a total replacement of sensible properties, we wouldn't think of it as the same thing at 2 different times. We would say, hey, what happened to the thing that was here at time 1? And where did this thing at time 2 come from? Because it's 2 totally different bundles of sensible properties. And yet we do know that it's the same thing at those 2 different times. So how is it that we know that? Well, we know that because intellect grasps what the piece of wax is essentially. What it is essentially is a material substance, something distinct from the bundle of sensible properties, something that is the underlying basis for them. Here again, I said a moment ago that the literal sense of whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. I said a moment ago that the literal sense of substance comes from this. Here again, it comes from the Latin term subtare, to support. So the literal sense of substance is a support of properties. But the support of properties itself isn't given to us in sensible experience, isn't given to us in perception. So what the properties are in, what the what it is that persists through that total change of properties, that is something that is not given to us in perception. That is something that is only grasped with the mind. That is something that is only grasped by intellect. We say that we see the wax itself. We say this kind of thing all the time. But on Descartes' indirect realism, when we say that kind of thing, that really has to be understood as elliptical for a more complicated situation. What is really going on is we are judging that a piece of wax is there, and we're making that judgment on the basis of a certain bundle of sensible properties, such as color and shape. We say that we see the wax itself, not that we judge it to be present from its color or shape. But strictly speaking, that's what's really going on, according to Descartes. Our judgments about things really have to do with, here again, what intellect grasps to be there, what intellect discerns to be in the world, as here again distinct from the flux of sensible properties that is given to us in perception. So there is a mind-independent world of material substances. There is a world external to mind. Descartes is, again, a realist. A mind-independent world of material substances is something real. But on Descartes' view, we get at it only very indirectly, and an awful lot of what is given to us in sensible experience is just in us. It's not in things. So let's go back to the example of the wax from a moment ago. Color, that's just in us. Sense, tastes, those are just in us. He does believe that the shape of a body really is in the body, but that is something that is grasped by intellect. Here again, we perceive shape. That's true, but we discern that shape is inseparable from body by intellect. Whereas here again, color is separable from body. Here again, in the case of the piece of wax, the piece of wax has undergone a change of shape, but that it has some shape or other is still an essential attribute of it because it's a body. But here again, as we've seen, we grasp the elements of corporeal nature by intellect. Color is separable from the body. Scent, taste. Here again, these are really just in us, not in the body, because as we've seen, the piece of wax survives losing those properties. So those properties aren't really in the piece of wax. They're really in us. They're really in the mind's representation of the thing in the world. Tactile properties like hard, soft, hot, cold. Here again, as we've seen, the piece of wax survives the loss of those properties. It started out hard and cold. At time 2, it was warm and soft. So neither of those properties were essential to the extended, mutable material substance. Hot, cold, hard, soft, those are really just in us. Sound, here again, the thing's acoustic property, the piece of wax survived a change of its acoustic properties. It doesn't have the same acoustic properties at time 2 that it had at time 1. But there still is the same piece of wax. Therefore, sounds are really just in us, not in the world. So an awful lot of the mind's representation of the world is really just in us. The mind represents the world in various ways. And here again, on this indirect realist view, it's the task of intellect. Descartes is a rationalist. He believes that reason is the source of knowledge. Perception, although it plays a role in us coming to understand the world, perception isn't the source of knowledge. Reason is. Descartes is a rationalist. He believes that reason is the source of knowledge. So I touched on this big epistemological question in the first lecture. What is the source of our knowledge? empiricists, as we've seen, like Hume, and we'll talk about other empiricists like Locke and Berkeley, give a lot of weight to perception as a source of knowledge. Descartes is a rationalist. He does not give perception much of a role in knowledge. Perception doesn't really rise to the level of knowledge for Descartes. Knowledge is, here again, discerned, what is discerned by reason, what is grasped by the intellect. So we do come to make true judgments about the world, but we make them on the basis of intellect, not on the basis of perception. Intellect has to scrutinize, has to think very carefully about, has to sort through the representations of the world that are given to us in perception. And an awful lot of what is given to us in perception is really just in us. So that is the indirect realist view. It's also sometimes called representative realism. Here again, the thought being that our mental states are representations of the world. Our mind represents the world as being various ways. And again, he is a realist in the sense that there is an external world. The world is something mind independent. It is something that exists independent of minds. But the mind's ability to represent that external world is such that, here again, we get at it only very indirectly. We have to think very critically about that representation of the world that we're given in perception. And the job of thinking about it critically, that's the job of the intellect. That's the task. That's the function of reason, intellect, mind. So we speak elliptically. We say that we see such things as, for example, a piece of wax. But strictly speaking, we see certain colors and shapes and infer the presence of the piece of wax. And that inference is a kind of judgment, and it's a kind of judgment that we make on the basis of our mind, reason, intellect's ability to think critically about the content of perception. He gives another example of, here again, the very indirect way, the very elliptical way that we get at reality. He talks about looking out the window and looking down on the public square. He was writing in the Netherlands at the time. And you may have some sense of how people dressed in 17th century Holland, in the Netherlands in the 17th century, especially in the cold weather, in the cold months especially. You probably have some sense that men wore very broad-brimmed hats, big heavy cloaks, capes sometimes. If you've ever seen a box of Dutch Masters cigars or any other kind, that's on the cover of every box of Dutch Masters cigars. There's a reproduction of a Rembrandt painting, the Syndics of the Cloth Guild, one of Rembrandt's many paintings in which he depicts daily life in 17th century Netherlands. And so if you've seen that picture, if you've seen that painting, you have some sense of how people dressed back in those days. And Descartes makes the point that when he's looking out the window, watching men scurry about, watching men hurry about early in the morning in the public square, setting up their stalls, their stands, produce stands and whatnot, setting up their operations. He's looking over a square, a little market, and he says, I judge that I see men walking around, but in thinking about the content of the perception more critically here, what do I really see? All I really see, if you were looking down, here again, given the description of the way people dressed in those days, think about it for a second. In the winter, you're looking down from a window on a square. What would you really see? You'd really just be seeing clothes. And Descartes uses this as another example of how the judgments that we make about the world are really critical judgments about the content of perception. That is to say, what we know about the world isn't really through perception. He says, what do I see aside from hats and clothes, which could conceal automata? So, strictly, he says, I see men hurrying about in the square. I judge that I see men, but actually, when you think critically about it, when you just look at the content of the actual perceptual representation of the mind, all I actually see are hats and clothes. And I'm inferring that those hats and clothes moving around, or under those hats and clothes moving around in the square, I'm inferring that those are human beings. But here again, that's something that is grasped by intellect, not by perception. Perception just shows us the colors and shapes. Just shows us, in this case, the hats and clothes. It's a judgment. It's an inference. And it's an inference arrived at by mind, by intellect, that those are people. What do I see aside from hats and clothes which could conceal automata? So his point is that underneath those hats and clothes moving around, there could just be what we would call today robots. The idea of an automaton in the 17th century was the idea of a kind of mechanical man, a kind of robot, or what we might call today an android or an AI system, an artificial intelligence system of some kind. Already back in the 17th century, they already had this idea of a mechanical man, an automaton. And his point is that that would be consistent with what we actually perceive. If we were just going off of perception, if we were just going off of our senses, then that hypothesis would be equally consistent with what we perceive. It could be men under the clothes, but all we're actually seeing are the hats and clothes. So it could just as well be very realistically moving automata. That's another possibility. That would be consistent with what we perceive. Now, we know that that's not the case. We know that there are people underneath the hats and clothes, but we don't know that on the basis of perception. That's his point. It's mind, it's intellect, it's reason that grasps what is really out there in reality. So, what I thought I had seen with my eyes, I actually grasped solely with the faculty of judgment, which is in my mind. So again, Descartes is a rationalist. He believes that reason is the source of knowledge. In this unit of the course, we'll talk about another version of indirect realism. We'll talk about John Locke's version. John Locke is a 17th century British philosopher and an empiricist. Locke believes the source of our knowledge is experience, including perceptual experience. So Descartes, the French rationalist, and Locke, the British empiricist, begin from quite different epistemological principles. They have different beliefs about knowledge, about the source of knowledge. But they have the same metaphysical view in the sense that they're both going to be realists of a certain kind, and indeed they're both going to be indirect realists. Locke also will argue that a mind-independent world of material substances, a world external to mind, is something real. That's the sense in which he's a realist. It's not something that depends on minds. It's mind-independent. That's what he means by real. But he, like Descartes, also believes that we get at it only very indirectly. And the way he will explain which aspects of the representation are accurate and which aspects of the mind's representation of the world are really just in us, the way that he will explain that will be a little bit different from what we're seeing in Descartes. Similar in some respects, but a little bit different too. So we'll talk about that next time when we come to Locke. In any case, it's mind, it's judgment, it's the faculty of intellect that grasps the way that the world really is. Reason is the source of our knowledge. Descartes is a rationalist. So if the self is essentially thinking substance or spiritual substance or mental substance, and the external world is composed of material substances, how is it that the one kind of thing comes to know a categorically different kind of thing? Material substances are in one metaphysical category. Here again, according to Descartes, there are two kinds of things: material substances and thinking substances. Material substances, that is to say bodies, like pieces of wax, all the other mundane, familiar bodies in the physical world around us, trees and rocks and rivers and houses. All these are material substances. If what the self is essentially, if what I am essentially, is thinking substance, how does the one kind of thing come to know the other kind of thing? There would seem to be a very basic problem, a very basic objection to this view. How could the one kind of thing interact with the other? They're in different categories. They're categorically different kinds of things. They have different properties, for example. So how could the one kind of thing act on the other? In the case of material substances, they have properties like weight and temperature and mass and velocity and electrical charge, all the kinds of properties that the natural sciences, maybe physics, studies. And on the other side of the divide, we have thinking substance. What are some properties of mind? What are some properties of your mental states? Well, not the properties of material substances, right? Your mental states aren't a certain color. Your mental states, your beliefs, your attitudes, your values, your memories, your likes, your dislikes. These things don't have a weight or a temperature or a velocity or a mass. They have quite different properties. So how could the one kind of thing act on the other? This is one of the difficulties with Cartesian dualism, to try to understand how the one kind of thing, here again, could act on the other, the problem of interaction. Well, part of Descartes' answer to that problem is that an immaterial, a non-physical thinking substance, mind, is stocked with certain innate ideas that we use to make sense of the world of material, of the external world of material substances, the world on the other side of that mind-body divide. So Descartes says that, I'm paraphrasing, but he says that some of my ideas could not have been produced by experience. They must be intrinsic to my mind because no experience could have produced them. So I just gave an example. Material substance itself is an innate idea. That was part of the point of the example of the wax, right? In the case of the piece of wax, here again, what we are given in perception are sensible properties, right? But what are the sensible properties in? Here again, hard, soft, hot, cold, color, aroma, taste. What are these sensible properties in? The point of the example of the wax was that what the piece of wax is essentially is something that is not grasped by perception, by the senses, but rather is something that is understood by mind, something that is grasped, here again, by the intellect. Well, if all that we're given in perception is the sensible properties, which are in flux, which are ephemeral, which change, as we've seen, none of which are essential to the piece of wax, then how do we know that this material substance, this supportive properties, this underlying metaphysical substratum, this underlying metaphysical basis of the sensible properties that persists through the change, how do we know that that's even there? Well, Descartes' answer is that the concept of substance is innate. We have certain innate ideas that we use to make sense of the flux of sensible properties in the physical world around us. So here again, the idea of substance has to be in us innately. And if there are ideas in me that I did not acquire, there must be something external to me, that is to say, the cause of these innate ideas. So Descartes' view is that God stocks the mind, furnishes the mind with certain innate ideas that we then use to make sense of the sensible world, the material world, the flux of sensible properties in the external world. If I myself cannot be the cause of the idea, then it necessarily follows that I am not alone in the world. So God is the source of these innate ideas that we use to make sense of the world. And that, of course, is also an idea that would have to be innate. The idea of God, too, would have to be innate because God is not something that we directly apprehend, that we perceive. The idea of God, Descartes says, could not have originated from me, although the idea of substance is in me by virtue of the fact that I am a substance. That fact is not sufficient to explain my having the idea of infinite substance, since I am finite. So Descartes conceives of God as an infinite spiritual substance. How would we get the idea of an infinite spiritual substance if we are finite creatures and we only ever perceive finite things, limited things, things that are limited to the boundaries of time and space? And for that matter, here again, not only would the idea of God, the idea of an infinite spiritual substance, have to be innate, but of course the concept of infinity itself, the concept of the infinite itself would have to be innate as well. Because we never perceive an infinitely long succession of events, or we never perceive an infinitely long division of body into parts. It isn't possible for us to perceive an infinitely long division or an infinitely long succession or an infinitely large collection of things. It isn't possible for us to perceive anything like that because we are finite beings. An infinite succession of events cannot come to an end. So it's not an idea we could get from perception. An infinitely long division of a body into parts, here again, in virtue of being infinite, could not have any limit, could not come to an end. So it's not an idea that we have on the basis of perception. We can't perceive something that never ends, and thereby get the idea of it as an infinitely long succession of events. We can't perceive an infinitely large collection of things. If the collection is infinite, then it has no limit. And we are finite creatures, so no matter how much time we spent attending to the members of the collection, we would still, finite beings that we are, never have exhausted the collection of things if it's infinite. So how do we get the idea of infinity? Here again, this must be an innate idea. Certain of the ideas we have are in us natively. The literal sense of that word is at birth. Right? Think of related words like the natal ward of the hospital where they keep the babies, or prenatal care, nutrition for women who are going to have babies. Right? The idea behind innate is that the ideas are already in us when we come into existence. As soon as a spiritual substance comes into existence on Descartes' view, it is already furnished with a certain stock of ideas. And Descartes' view is that we know this because the ideas could not have come from experience. That was the point about substance in the example of the wax. Here again, the idea of God. God must be if there are ideas in me that could not have come from me, that I could not have acquired, then the source must be an infinite spiritual substance. Well, the concept of an infinite spiritual substance, the idea of God, is itself an idea that is in me innately because it could not have been acquired from experience. The concept of infinity, he also gives the example of perfection. Here again, we'd never perceive anything perfect, and yet we have the concept of perfection. So the concept of perfection must be innate. How would I understand that I lack something and that I am not wholly perfect unless there were some idea in me of a more perfect being by comparison with which I might recognize my defects. So here again, the concept of perfection is innate as well. So the mind is stocked with a number of innate ideas that we use to make sense of the world. And this is broadly Descartes' answer to the question, how does the mind, a thinking substance, come to know an external world of material substances? We come to know it through intellect, and intellect in coming to know the external world relies to a great extent on innate ideas. Descartes says that God has given me a great inclination to believe that these ideas of sensible objects issue from corporeal things. Consequently, corporeal things exist. At least they do contain everything I clearly and distinctly understand. So, how can we know that the mind's representation of an external world, here again the representation happens in immaterial thinking substance, the external world is a collection of material substances, how can we be confident that that representation is at all accurate? We know, we've already seen that on Descartes' view an awful lot of it is not accurate. We have good reason to believe that colors, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile properties like hot, cold, hard, soft, rough, smooth, those are not really in material substances. Those are just in us. So what confidence can we have that the mind's representation of the world has any accuracy at all, has any truth to it at all? Well, we find ourselves with these innate ideas. They could have only come from God, and we use these innate ideas to make sense of the world. Therefore, we can be confident that at least everything that we clearly and distinctly understand about the world of corporeal things, the world of bodies, the world of material substances, everything that intellect grasps, that reason grasps about the external world, we can be confident that at least those judgments are true.